This sapele is fresh from the wood store. It's not cheap, and we're gonna be using it to make a fancy-ass coffee table, very modern, and I'm gonna make the legs with the shape or origin, so check that out. If you've ever wanted to make a fancy, modern-looking coffee table, watch this video and I'll walk you through step by step how I'm gonna go about making it from bringing the lumber home from the lumber yard to the finished product. So once you get your lumber from your lumber yard, I prefer to get S2S lumber, meaning two sides are already planed. For the top, I have 5/4 thick pieces. For the bottom shelf, it's 4/4. And then because it's this time of year, I'm about 40 quarters. Anyway, so once I've organized my thicknesses, I like to just lay out the wood to see what the top will ultimately look like and make sure I like the grain direction. Then I give it a quick mark. I just use like a 1, 2, 3 to know exactly which ones are going which way. So then I take it to the jointer to clean up that edge. I know my top and my bottom are parallel because S2S means that that top and bottom are parallel. And then to square up the other edge, my preferred method is the table saw. I've always found that this method works really, really well. There's a couple tricks you can do if it's not perfect for your panel glue-ups, but generally if you use a feather board and you're taking your time with it, you're gonna have really good panel pieces to ultimately put together. Now you might say, well, why are you taking it to the planer? And that's really just to get rid of any imperfections that are left over from the milling process. The next step we need to go through is building these tops. Now, one thing you might have noticed is I suddenly have these smaller pieces instead of the pieces down the middle, and just aesthetically I liked that a little bit more. The danger of that, the risk you run, is that if I use dominoes or if I use biscuits to joint these at all, if you end up cutting it to final dimension too tight, you can end up revealing those biscuits or dominoes. So just be wary of how wide your boards are and what your final dimension is before you use any thinner boards on the outside. For me, it's gonna be just fine. And now I can move on to the step of drawing out my carpenter's triangles and making sure that these line up so that I can then joint them together and get them into actual boards that will be usable for this final coffee table. Now, sneaky guy, I'm using a domino here. You don't need a domino. I actually prefer to use biscuits on panel glue-ups like this because really all you're doing is aligning things. But I was out of biscuits. I have a domino. I also accidentally ordered all of these kind of expensive 8mm dominoes, and I was like, you know what, these are a nice color, and so I'm gonna just use these. So after taking everything out of the clamps, you can check that everything looks good, scrape away any excess glue, and then in my case, I made these blanks for the legs, and I had to go basically back through that milling process and clean up those blanks because I needed them to be perfectly equal before taking it to the shape or origin. One of the benefits of the shape or origin is you don't need a pattern to cut out your pieces. The shaper can do those each uniquely. The drawback of it is that it only has a depth of, I believe it's like 1.5 inches approximately, and I needed to cut 2 inches out. So I had to use my other tools to clean up these legs. I actually messed up a little bit with my shaper. I didn't have the router collet locked perfectly, and it started doing this weird jumping thing that I just wasn't really expecting. Nevertheless, it worked out, but I had to clean that up. You can see here, there's a little chip out and it's not perfect along the edge. So fortunately, I had enough meat on there that I could mill these down again and end up having really clean, perfect stock. So I took it over to the jointer right there, and then I used my new Bosch miter saw. Thank God for this thing. I used to have that rigid, and it was so imprecise. This thing is right on the money. It cuts really nicely, really squarely. It's also, interestingly, a lot quieter. If you're looking for a miter saw upgrade, I really recommend that. So then I was worried about the legs being level, so I quickly took them over to the table, just used a little spot level and set it on a reference edge, and they were perfect. The next challenge I had was the inside of the cut. So generally the insides were really cut well on the shape or origin and gave me that one reference side, and so I could use a small pattern bit to cut that. But problem was the 1/4 inch pattern bit didn't reach deep enough because these are almost 2 inches deep. I have a 1/2 inch collet router bit, and clearly that one will reach the whole way. Now, for whatever reason, I don't use 1/2 inch pattern bits very often. I have that one, I've used it once before, and for some reason they intimidate me, even though they really shouldn't. But sometimes when you're first at a router table and things are spinning really fast, you just want to make sure you don't have anything fly anywhere or something. I'm not really sure what was going through my head, but for some reason I was really nervous about this part. So my advice is, if you're in the same kind of space, take your time. You'll notice here, I think I was really just overthinking the safety part of it, which is probably good in a wood shop, and I ended up burning a couple different spots. Now, once I got through this initial cut and started feeling more confident with the router, I then ended up putting my fence on, having more dust collection so it's not just blowing everywhere, and having a lot of success in routing out the legs from this. And ultimately, I probably just could have used that bit for the entire leg now that I was comfortable with it, but any process works as long as it gets you to your end point. Once the rough milling was done, then I just needed to mark where my dominoes were going to fall for the loose tenon joinery that I'm going to use to attach the legs to the base. Now, part of me was worried about wood movement and whether or not having the dominoes attached to the base would be a problem over time, but I've done it before and it's been fine for years based on seeing it in people's homes, so I'm not too worried about it. It's also a really nice 1/4 sawn sapele, so I'm not too worried about movement being a huge problem or causing any chaos. Speaking of chaos, a bit I'm actually much more comfortable with because I've used it a ton is a roundover bit like this, just a 1/4 inch shank here. And despite that comfort and thinking I know exactly what I'm doing, I got to this end grain, and going right to the edge, you'll know what's going to happen if you're a woodworker. I blew off some of that end grain like a total dummy. Fortunately, I'm able to clean that up by a really pretty simple technique. If you haven't done this before, you basically just cut out a chunk that creates a nice 90-degree cut and then find some wood that matches it. And I just made a triangle out of that to kind of match basically what the shape is, and then I could just clean it up nicely. So for placing the legs, I made sure to measure evenly from both ends, which was 14 3/4, and then placing each leg based on the width of the lower shelf, because I wanted that lower shelf to connect to the bottom of the legs. And then I just used a super scientific technique of marking basically the exterior of the legs, which then I could use as a reference for the domino. I plunged the mortises for each loose tenon, and then I used my super scientific technique of kind of inchworming it forward to make sure that I had the spacing correct. I didn't have a reference piece to move from, so I was just kind of going with what I figured would work. And, you know, the good thing is it worked, and sometimes there are multiple ways to do things, even if they're probably not the most conventional ways to do it. And once I had those mortises drilled, I was able to put the legs on and then use another scientific technique, which is called the Double Sustainer Height Measuring Guide, which is not sponsored by Festool. I was going for a fairly minimalist look on this coffee table, so instead of using any kind of hardware, I cut out some dowels that would attach the legs to the lower shelf. And so that just required to cut some holes that would correspond between the legs and the shelf. And with some simple marking from one to the next, you can align those holes pretty easily and then stick in that rod. And with some glue, it's a really strong way to connect your legs to a lower shelf. But before we can get to glue, we have to do all of the finish sanding and making sure it's ready for stain. I really encourage that you do all that sanding and staining before you glue anything up. It'll just make it a lot faster and easier to go through, because the process can be a lot, and as much as you can repeat things and use efficiencies to get through those different steps, the better. That's the end of the Flamo Sapele coffee table build. Thanks for watching. This was a ton of fun to do, and hopefully I'll see you next time.